Chapter 1. The Picnic on the Green. The day of the vicar's picnic dawned with a kind of gentle radiance that only the English countryside could produce. A faint mist had clung to the hedgerows early in the morning, silvering every leaf and cobweb, but by 10 o'clock the sun had emerged, a mild, dignified sun, not given to any gaudy brilliance. The village of Marple seemed to bask contentedly in it, as though it too were quietly pleased with itself. In the centre of the village green, bunting had been strung between oak trees. Folding tables stood like sentinels along the grass, each laid with checked cloths and crowned with pyramids of sponge cakes. Crusty loaves, jars of homemade chutney, and cheerful bowls of roses from local gardens. The hum of bees from the nearby churchyard mingled with the first notes of a brass band tuning up by the lich gate. Miss Jane Marple arrived shortly after 11:30, her steps small and steady, her black straw hat adorned with a modest cluster of violets. She paused near the cricket pavilion to watch the vicar's wife, Mrs. Cartwright, directing a trio of flustered young men attempting to erect a marquee. Their poles clattered like mismatched knitting needles. Such industry, Miss Marple murmured to no one in particular, and such confusion. She proceeded to a shaded bench near the rose beds, where she could see everything while appearing to see nothing. This was a habit of hers. She had long discovered that one learns more by sitting quietly than by bustling about. Before long, several villagers had drifted near to offer her greetings. Mrs. Wilmot from the post office with her vigorous handshake, Mr. Nash the schoolmaster with his precise bow, and young Lydia Cartwright, the vicar's niece, who bobbed like a buoy in her eagerness to be of service. By noon, the picnic was in full swing. Children shrieked in delight over a sack race, the band stumbled cheerfully through green sleeves, and tables groaned under the weight of trifles, jellies, pork pies, and cold roast chickens. There was laughter and the occasional clink of teacups on saucers. Marple, at least for the moment, was the picture of harmony, and then quite suddenly, the harmony cracked. It was just as the prizes for the baking competition were being announced. Mrs. Cartwright had taken the small platform by the bandstand, holding aloft a silver cup, when a strangled cry came from the far side of the green. Heads turned. Several people hurried toward the source of the disturbance, a cluster of guests near the shaded grove beyond the tables. Miss Marple rose, not hurriedly, but with the decisive air of someone who already suspected that something of consequence had occurred. She threaded her way between picnic rugs and overturned wicker hampers, and came at last to the small circle of villagers who stood gaping. On the grass lay Mr. Geoffrey Pritchard, a prosperous local solicitor known for his loudly checked waistcoats and louder opinions. His waistcoat today was green plaid. It clashed horribly with the deep, unnatural pallor of his face. One hand was clenched near his collar, as though he had tried to loosen it. His eyes stared blankly at the sky through spectacles slightly askew. Dr. Selby knelt beside him, fingers pressed to his throat. After a moment he looked up and shook his head gravely. "He's gone." A murmur rippled through the gathering. Mrs. Wilmot clapped a hand to her mouth. Lydia Cartwright began to cry in earnest. The brass band, unsure what else to do, fell silent halfway through a bar of Rule Britannia. Was it heat-stroke? Ventured Mrs. Cartwright faintly. Dr. Selby hesitated, his brow furrowing. Possibly, though the day is not particularly hot. Miss Marple stood just behind them, her gaze lingering for an instant on the half-empty glass tumbler lying in the grass a few feet from Mr. Pritchard's outstretched hand. A sticky smear of something dark clung to its rim. She noted it in silence, then gently took Lydia by the elbow and led her aside. "There now," she said softly. "Best to give him air." Of course, air was quite useless now, but people often behaved more sensibly if one said such things. Within minutes, the The scene had shifted from picnic gaiety to something more muted and fractured. The vicar sent young Tom Beasley running for the constable. Guests began speaking in hushed voices, their eyes darting like nervous birds. Dr. Selby stood and declared that no one was to touch the body until the authorities arrived. The tables of jellies and trifles stood neglected under the sun, their colours garish and oddly grotesque in the new stillness. Miss Marple returned to her bench, folding her hands over the knob of her parasol. Her face was as placid as ever, yet her eyes were alert. She had seen that look before, the sudden collapse of a man in apparent health, the hurried verdict of heart failure or heat stroke, and she had long ago learned that such explanations, while often correct, were sometimes convenient, as the village constable, Sergeant Weatherby, pedalled hastily onto the green 20 minutes later. Miss Marple allowed herself the smallest of sighs. She had come to the picnic expecting only to judge the sponge. Cakes, but she suspected she would be judging something far more serious. Chapter 2. Gossip on the green by late afternoon. The village green no longer resembled a place of festivity. The bunting hung slack as though ashamed of its former cheer. The tables of trifles and pork pies stood abandoned, bees crawling lazily over the sugar-crusted wreckage. Only a few stubborn paper cups rolled across the grass. Nudged by a faint breeze from the churchyard, Constable Weatherby had done his best to impose order on what he repeatedly termed a scene of some gravity. This chiefly involved pacing around Mr. Pritchard's covered body with his notebook held like a weapon, and instructing everyone to remain where they were at the time of the incident. As this had been a picnic, with villagers scattered like seeds in every direction, the instruction was met with a certain polite confusion. By 3:30, the body had been carried to Dr. Selby's surgery to await the coroner, and the crowd had begun to thin. They did not go home, however. They simply retreated to doorways, garden gates, and the church porch, where they spoke in urgent whispers that carried very easily in the still air. Miss Marple, having quietly folded her picnic rug and placed it in her wicker basket, walked at her usual unhurried pace along the edge of the green. She paused near the lich gate where two figures spoke in low voices, Mrs. Wilmot of the post office and Mr. Nash, the schoolmaster. "Quite certain he was perfectly well this morning," Mrs. Wilmot was saying, shaking her head with vigour. "Collected a registered letter from me at 9:30, fresh as a daisy." "Overwork, perhaps?" said Mr. Nash doubtfully. "Solicitors do get into a fearful muddle with other people's money. The strain, you know." "Strain doesn't make your lips go blue," said Mrs. Wilmot grimly. Miss Marple, without appearing to do so, noted this remark and tucked it away in the quiet filing cabinet of her mind. Blue lips. Yes, that was rather interesting. A few paces farther on she encountered Mrs. Cartwright, the vicar's wife, who was speaking in hushed, trembling tones to Lydia. The girl's tear-streaked face was blotched and pale. "It is dreadful, simply dreadful," Mrs. Cartwright was murmuring. "Poor Geoffrey Pritchard." And right in the midst of the sponge cakes, Lydia gave a sudden hiccuping sob. Do you suppose someone gave him something, Aunt Beatrice? Something in his drink? Good gracious, child. Why should anyone wish to do such a thing?" But Lydia only twisted her handkerchief. Miss Marple, standing a few feet away pretending to examine a rosebush, saw the girl's eyes flick, just briefly, toward the abandoned glass tumbler that Constable Weatherby had carefully placed on the edge of a picnic table. There was fear in her glance, yes, but something more as well. Knowledge, perhaps, or suspicion. Miss Marple decided to speak gently. "You were nearby, I think, my dear, when poor Mr. Pritchard fell." Lydia, startled, then nodded mutely. "Did you notice if he seemed unwell beforehand? Any trembling of the hands or shortness of breath?" Lydia hesitated. He was laughing at something Mr. Crouch said about the cricket scores. And then he stopped. She swallowed. "It was ever so quick." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "It usually is." Mrs. Cartwright blinked at her.
Usually?
But Miss Marple only smiled faintly as though she had said something about the weather. That evening, as the church bell tolled 6, the gossip grew bolder. At the Red Hart Inn, where the air smelled of ale and polished wood, the village men had gathered in a conspiratorial knot near the fireplace despite the warmth of the evening. Poison, declared Mr. Crouch, who sold agricultural supplies and relished dramatic pronouncements. Mark my words.
That's what does for a man so sudden like.
Arsenic, probably. Or strychnine. Rubbish, said old Major Pembroke, who had retired to Marleycombe after India and had a chest like a barrel. If it were poison, he'd have shown signs.
Agony, convulsions.
The chap just keeled over. Plenty of poisons do it neat and quiet, muttered Crouch darkly.
And he had enemies. Enemies?
Pembroke barked. Who, for pity's sake? Crouch looked mysterious. Legal matters. Bound to be some poor soul he bled white in court. Major Pembroke snorted but said nothing further. The idea had planted itself, as such ideas always do. Outside the inn, Miss Marple passed quietly on her way home. She had not joined the circle inside. She seldom did. But she had paused near the open window just long enough to hear Crouch's tone and to notice how Mr. Beasley, the vicar's verger, had looked up sharply at the word enemies. Mr. Beasley, usually the most placid of men, had gone rather white around the mouth. Miss Marple reached her cottage on the lane by the church just as the first evening star appeared. She set her basket on the scrubbed pine table in her sitting room, unpinned her hat, and placed it on its stand. Then she sat down by the window with her knitting and gazed out into the dusk. It was, she reflected, a very great mistake to suppose that life in a quiet village contained no malice. Indeed, it was often quite the reverse. Large passions could be carried very quietly under very small hats. She had no proof, of course, not yet, but she had seen Mr. Pritchard that morning on the High Street, brisk and ruddy-cheeked, and she had seen the blue tinge about his lips when he lay on the grass. And she had seen Lydia's look of frightened knowledge. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. The village would chatter and speculate for days. But somewhere among their half-truths and whisperings, the truth was already peeping through, and she meant to find it. Chapter 3. The first clues, the morning after the picnic, dawned grey and subdued, as though the weather itself were observing propriety. Marleycombe, which usually stirred early with the sound of milk churns and the chatter of sparrows on slate roofs, seemed unusually hushed. Curtains remained drawn a little later than usual. Footsteps were muted on the cobbled lanes. Miss Marple, however, rose at her customary hour of 6:30. She breakfasted on a soft-boiled egg, 1 slice of toast, and a small dish of stewed apricots, and then took her habitual turn about the garden. The roses, heavy with dew, bowed their heads as if in mourning. By 9 o'clock she had donned her sensible grey tweed coat and walked briskly to the High Street, pausing only to exchange quiet greetings. There was an air of strained politeness about the villagers this morning. They greeted her, but their eyes slid away quickly, and conversation seemed to stop the moment she passed. The death of Geoffrey Pritchard had unsettled them more than they cared to admit. He had been a man both respected and disliked. Respected for his sharp, legal mind, disliked for the same reason. And though Marleycombe prided itself on good manners, death, especially sudden death, had a way of unpicking the stitches of civility. Miss Marple's first stop was the post office, ostensibly to purchase a sheet of stamps. Mrs. Wilmot served her with brisk efficiency, though her usual chatter was absent. Her lips were set in a thin line, a terrible business.
"Yesterday," Miss Marple said gently as she counted her change. Mrs. Wilmot nodded once,
her eyes flicking up to meet Miss Marple's. "He was here not 2 hours before it happened. Took a delivery of a registered letter from a London firm, perhaps legal-looking it was. Brown envelope-typed address. He signed with a very steady hand, mind you.
No sign of, well, anything. Curious, said Miss Marple mildly. I suppose the letter went home with him? Oh, yes.
Tucked it in his briefcase. Mrs. Wilmot hesitated, then lowered her voice.
Do you think
it might have been something in that letter? Bad news, I mean? It is possible, Miss Marple agreed, though bad news rarely kills so swiftly. Mrs. Wilmot shivered slightly and pushed the stamp book toward her. Best not to think of it. Quite so, said Miss Marple. She slipped the stamps into her handbag and left with a small smile of thanks. Her next visit was to Dr. Selby's surgery. The doctor was in his consulting room, sleeves rolled up, spectacles perched on his forehead. He looked harassed and rather sleep-deprived. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, pushing a stack of papers aside. "I suppose you've come about Pritchard."
everyone else has? I had thought, said Miss Marple in her gentlest tone, that you might tell me as an old woman who worries about things whether he
Suffered. Dr. Selby rubbed his chin.
No, it was very quick.
Heart stopped clean.
Frankly, it looks like sudden cardiac arrest. Indeed, Miss Marple murmured.
And yet I thought—
His lips seemed rather blue, Selby paused.
You noticed that? One does notice little things, said Miss Marple. The doctor sighed and leaned back. Yes, I noticed it too. Could be poor oxygenation, which fits with cardiac failure. But there was also, well, a faint odour about him. Bitter almonds.
Only a trace. Ah, said Miss Marple softly.
That is sometimes associated with cyanide, Selby said grimly. But it's not conclusive. The coroner will run tests. Of course, Miss Marple said. She rose with a little nod. You have been most kind. As she left, she reflected that Dr. Selby was a competent man, though inclined, as so many men were, to dismiss what he could not immediately measure. Bitter almonds, blue lips. They were small things, but Miss Marple had often found that murders were built upon such small things. Her final call that morning was at the vicarage. Mrs. Cartwright received her in the drawing-room, which smelled strongly of lavender polish. Lydia was there too, perched stiffly on a straight-backed chair, with her hands clenched in her lap. She looked as though she had not slept. Miss Marple, accepting a cup of weak tea, spoke of the roses, the weather, and the price of eggs, topics which seemed to relax Mrs. Cartwright, but made Lydia twitchier by the minute. At last, Miss Marple set down her cup with a delicate clink. "My dear," she said to Lydia, "yesterday you seemed quite shaken." Lydia coloured.
Anyone would be. Yes, said Miss Marple.
"But you also seemed—"
Frightened.
"Which is not quite the same thing," Mrs. Cartwright blinked. "Frightened?" Lydia bit her lip.
Ah, it's only that she stopped, glancing at her aunt. It's silly. Very likely, Miss Marple agreed kindly.
Most true things sound silly at first. Lydia hesitated a long moment, then whispered, "Mr. Pritchard." He said something just before. No one else heard. He bent toward me and said, "They'll be sorry now." And then he laughed. "They'll be sorry now," Miss Marple repeated softly.
That is not silly at all, Mrs. Cartwright stared.
Whatever could he have meant?
That, said Miss Marple, is exactly what we must find out later.
Walking home along the sunken lane by the churchyard, Miss Marple's thoughts moved with quiet precision. A registered letter from London, a glass with a dark residue on its rim, a trace of bitter almonds, a dying man who said, "They'll be sorry now." Yes, there were threads here, very fine threads, almost invisible, but she had spent a lifetime mending delicate lacework, and she meant to see what pattern these threads would form. Chapter 4. A wrong suspect by the following afternoon. The quiet rhythm of Marleycombe had been briskly disrupted by the arrival of an outsider. Detective Inspector Graves from the County Constabulary appeared just past 2 o'clock in a motor car so polished it looked almost scandalous beside the modest stone cottages. He was a tall, square-shouldered man with an air of tidy impatience and a moustache like a wire brush. Constable Weatherby, who looked perpetually apologetic even at the best of times, met him at the edge of the green and began a flustered recital of the facts. Graves listened with thinly veiled irritation, glancing now and then at his watch as though the entire village were keeping him from something more important. Miss Marple, passing by at that precise moment on her way from the grocer's, paused in the lee of the churchyard wall to observe. Her eyes twinkled faintly. She had seen Inspector Graves before, during the matter of the bishop's mislaid silver, and remembered him as the sort of man who preferred evidence to understanding, a useful quality in some ways, though not always a reliable one. By 3:30, Graves had installed himself in the vestry as an impromptu office and was taking statements with military briskness. Villagers emerged from their interviews pink-faced and flustered, clutching their hats as though they had been through a storm. The rumour mill churned ferociously. It was just before tea when word spread that Inspector Graves had made an arrest. The news travelled as all news did in Marleycombe, invisibly and instantaneously. By the time Miss Marple returned from posting a letter, Mrs. Wilmot was already at her garden gate, lips pursed. "They've taken young Beasley," she said, in a fierce whisper. Miss Marple blinked mildly. "Mr. Beasley, the verger?" "Yes, the very same. Marched him straight off like a common criminal."
I saw it with my own eyes.
"Said he had means, motive, and opportunity?" "Indeed," said Miss Marple, who had heard that particular trio of words often enough to treat them with caution. "And what was the motive, if one may ask?" Mrs. Wilmot leaned closer. "Money, they say. Seems Mr. Pritchard had been trustee to Beasley's late uncle's estate."
There were
"Irregularities. Beasley accused him of cheating him out of his inheritance." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly, "how very unfortunate." "And," Mrs. Wilmot added, swelling with the satisfaction of further detail, "they found a small bottle in Beasley's tool cupboard at the church, marked potassium cyanide. Used it for polishing the brass, so he claims." Miss Marple inclined her head, thanked Mrs. Wilmot for the information, and walked on at her usual unhurried pace. But, behind her placid expression, her mind was knitting faster than her fingers ever had. That evening, she called quietly at the vicarage. The vicar himself, Reverend Cartwright, was in his study among dusty commentaries, but Mrs. Cartwright received her at once. "You've heard about poor Mr. Beasley," she began, clearly distressed. "It's dreadful."
I can't believe it of him." "No," said Miss Marple gently.
"Nor can I. He's been verger here 20 years. He polishes the candlesticks till they shine like the sun."
Always so earnest. "Quite," said Miss Marple. "And tell me, did he seem angry toward Mr. Pritchard?"
Mrs. Cartwright hesitated, perhaps a little resentful once, but no more than others. Geoffrey Pritchard could be
"Rather cutting." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "and men who are cutting often collect a quantity of small resentments."
"But resentment does not always lead to murder." Mrs. Cartwright looked at her searchingly.
"Do you think they've got the wrong man?"
Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think it is very seldom the right man is the first one chosen." At dusk, Miss Marple walked to the church where Beasley had been taken earlier for questioning before being sent to the county jail. The place was deserted now, the air cool and scented with brass polish and old hymnals. She moved quietly about the vestry, examining the tool cupboard that had yielded the suspicious bottle. It was an ordinary bottle, dusty and half full, labelled in an old, faded hand. She noted that the stopper was stiff with disuse.
That was curious.
If Beasley had used it recently to polish brass, it would not be so crusted. She also noticed something else, a faint, dark smear on the inside edge of a brass polishing cloth lying beside it.
Not almondy, not cyanide. Something stickier.
Something more like the residue she had seen on the rim of the glass at the picnic. Miss Marple stood very still. It was all very interesting indeed. Later, in her own parlour, with the canary-yellow lamp glowing beside her chair, Miss Marple set down her knitting and gazed thoughtfully into the fire. Inspector Graves, she knew, would be perfectly satisfied. A motive, a bottle, and a suspect who had once raised his voice to the deceased, it was enough for him. But Miss Marple had lived too long and seen too much of human nature to be convinced by such tidy arrangements. Beasley might have had reason. He might even have had the means, but he had not, she thought quite firmly. The temperament, and temperament, in her experience, was the thing people always forgot to condemn. Chapter 5. Secrets begin to surface. Marleycombe had resumed its outward appearance of calm by the next morning, though it was a brittle sort of calm, like a pond frozen thinly over. Curtains fluttered in their usual places, the baker's bell jingled cheerily at 8:30, and the milk cart clattered down the high street. Yet beneath the veneer of routine, something restless stirred. The arrest of Mr. Beasley had not soothed the village as Inspector Graves clearly imagined it would. Instead, it had sharpened their whispers to knives. Suspicion did not disappear when given a target. It merely spread its roots elsewhere. Miss Marple, who understood this principle very well, observed from her cottage window as two women conversed fiercely over their front gate, heads bent close. She could not hear their words, but their posture said enough. Marleycombe was no longer a place of untroubled mornings. She put down her teacup and reached for her hat. Her first call of the day was at the solicitor's, office of Pritchard and Hayworth on Market Lane. The blinds were drawn halfway, and the brass nameplate on the door looked strangely forlorn without Mr. Pritchard's brisk silhouette bustling behind it. Miss Marple was received by Mr. Hayworth, a nervous man in his 50s with thinning hair and a tendency to polish his spectacles whenever a pause arose. He ushered her into the dim-panelled office, where the faint smell of sealing wax and old paper hung in the air. "I wonder," Miss Marple said with her most fluttering smile, "if you might indulge an old woman's curiosity. Poor Mr. Pritchard's affairs must fall heavily upon you just now." Hayworth grimaced.
Yes, dreadful business, shocking. I can scarcely credit it even now.
"We were partners 15 years, you know." "Indeed?" Miss Marple murmured.
And was he content of late?
"Not troubled or preoccupied." Hayworth hesitated. "Well, there was something." He'd been secretive these last weeks. Closed-door meetings, private correspondence. Kept certain files locked in his desk, which was unlike him. He paused, lowering his voice. "And, forgive me, Miss Marple, but he mentioned being blackmailed." Miss Marple's eyes widened ever so slightly.
Blackmailed by whom?
Hayworth shook his head. He didn't say, only that they wouldn't dare once the picnic was past. I thought it an odd remark. "Indeed," said Miss Marple softly. "Very odd." As she rose to go, she let her eyes drift to the filing cabinet behind his desk. A slim brown envelope lay atop it, stamped London and marked Private. Hayworth noticed her glance and flushed slightly before hastily sliding it beneath a ledger. Miss Marple merely smiled and thanked him for his time, but as she stepped back into the sunlight of Market Lane, her mind was humming like a beehive. Her next visit was purely social, or so it appeared. She stopped by the home of Mrs. Pritchard, the solicitor's widow, who lived in a neat Georgian house on Willowbank Row. The curtains were drawn, and the house smelled faintly of lilies. Mrs. Pritchard received her in a black silk gown with lace at the collar. She was a handsome woman in her mid-40s, with cold grey eyes and a mouth too firm for grief. Miss Marple, who had consoled many widows in her day, noted this dispassionate composure without comment. "My dear," she said gently, "I am most dreadfully sorry." "Thank you," said Mrs. Pritchard, her tone flat. "It is a great blow."
Geoffrey was
"A pillar." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "And such a pillar must have borne a great many burdens." Mrs. Pritchard's gaze flicked toward the mantelpiece. "He did. More than people knew." Miss Marple sipped her tea delicately. "Did he ever speak of feeling himself?"
In danger?
There was a pause. He said some people wished him harm, Mrs. Pritchard said at last. But Geoffrey liked to dramatize. He had enemies, of course. One does, in his profession. But he thrived on it. Yes, Miss Marple murmured.
And he thrived on something else too, perhaps. Mrs. Pritchard's eyes sharpened.
What do you mean? Oh, nothing at all, Miss Marple said sweetly, and changed the subject to roses. Yet when she left, she walked slowly down Willowbank Row with her brows slightly knit. Mrs. Pritchard had not once used the word sad, nor had she asked about the investigation. It was not grief Miss Marple had seen in her eyes, but something far more brittle. Relief, perhaps, or fear. That afternoon, she encountered Lydia Cartwright near the grocer's. The girl looked paler than ever, her usual springy step subdued. She greeted Miss Marple politely, but without her usual smile. "My dear," Miss Marple said, "you mustn't fret so. It will all come right." Lydia gave a strained little laugh. "Will it? Aunt Beatrice says so too, but I'm not sure she believes it." "Doubt," said Miss Marple kindly, "is often the sign of a very good mind." Lydia hesitated. Then, in a low rush, "I heard them quarrelling, you know. Mr. Pritchard and Mrs. Pritchard. The night before the picnic. I was walking back from choir practice and the window was open."
She said. Lydia broke off, glancing about.
She said, "If you ruin us, I'll see you in the ground first." "Indeed," said Miss Marple softly. "How very—"
Forceful. She didn't mean it, Lydia said quickly.
She couldn't have. "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, "and perhaps not." That evening, back at her rose-bordered cottage, Miss Marple took out her notebook, a plain brown thing, battered at the corners, and wrote down the threads she had gathered. Registered letter from London blackmail Mrs. Pritchard's strange composure, a marital quarrel overheard, cyanide, bottle unused in Beasley's cupboard, bitter almond scent to yes.
Lips, they'll be sorry now, she
Set down her pencil and folded her hands. There were secrets here.
long-buried ones.
She could feel them stirring beneath the village's polite surface, like foxes in the hedgerow at dusk, and soon, she thought, they would begin to come out. Chapter 6. The Quiet Watcher. Rain had settled over Willowbrook, soft and persistent, drumming gently on the slate roofs and trickling down the leaded window panes of the cottages. The picnic grounds behind St. Luke's were abandoned now, scattered with damp bunting and forgotten cups, looking as though a summer dream had been left out overnight to wilt. Inside, the village carried on with a quieter step. Curtains twitched less. Doors stayed closed. Even the postman delivered his letters with a sort of furtive caution, as though words themselves might carry contagion. Miss Marple sat in her parlour at the corner of Rosewood Lane, her knitting needles clicking softly, while her mind wandered far from the gentle clack of the hearth clock. Before her on the table lay the morning's newspaper, folded to the column about the ongoing investigation. The words were few, vague, and unsatisfactory.
Local man remains in custody.
Police confident of swift resolution. Such confident statements usually meant quite the opposite, Miss Marple knew. She pursed her lips and counted quietly to herself, finishing off another row of soft grey wool. The bell tinkled, and her housekeeper, young Edna, appeared, carrying in the afternoon's post. "Just this one, ma'am," she said, handing over a square envelope with elegant handwriting across it. "Looks important." "Thank you, Edna." Miss Marple opened it with her small silver letter knife, smoothing out the note. It was from Mrs. Prowse, the doctor's wife, a nervous woman forever apologizing. The letter contained only a brief invitation to tea later that afternoon, with a suggestion they might speak of certain things privately. Miss Marple tapped the corner of the note on the arm of her chair. Mrs. Prowse was no gossip by nature, but when her conscience pressed her, she tended to confide. And conscience, Miss Marple reflected, had been stirring in more than one person lately. Mrs. Prowse's drawing-room was warm and overstuffed, its furniture arranged as though to discourage the very idea of straight lines. She offered Miss Marple a plate of currant scones and spoke in low tones while the clock chimed discreetly on the mantel. "It's about Mr. Halcombe," she began, eyes darting to the doorway though no one was near.
"The curate."
"You know he was one of the last to see poor Mr. Pendleton alive. My husband said as much, though he won't discuss it with me further." She sighed. "But there's something
"Unsettling about the man lately."
He's been seen walking near the vicarage after midnight, twice at least, and he's taken to visiting Mrs. Whitcomb rather often, more than seems necessary." Mrs. Whitcomb. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, delicately buttering her scone. "A housekeeper at the vicarage?"
"Yes, a grim woman. Keeps to herself, but very knowing."
"They say she worked in a household once where a terrible scandal occurred." "I don't know the details." Miss Marple listened without comment, but her eyes grew thoughtful. She had noticed Mr. Halcombe's nervous air at the picnic, his tendency to glance about as though watching for someone who never came. "And—" Mrs. Prowse leaned closer, lowering her voice to a whisper.
"The curate has debts."
My husband heard it from the solicitor's wife.
"Cards of all things."
"He lost nearly £50 at some dreadful little club in Marleycombe." Miss Marple's fingers paused on her teacup. £50 was a very tidy sum for a man of the cloth. That evening, back in her own sitting room, Miss Marple took out her small black notebook. She made neat little jottings. Halcombe, seen after midnight near vicarage, frequent visits to Mrs. Whitcomb, gambling debts. Motive? Pendleton insurance policy rumour? Her pencil tapped against the paper. "People will do very foolish things when they are frightened," she murmured to herself, "and sometimes even more foolish things when they are in love." The clock chimed 9. Outside the rain had stopped. The village lay wrapped in damp silence. Miss Marple rose, drawing her shawl about her thin shoulders, and crossed to the window. From her vantage she could see the path toward the vicarage, just visible between the hedges, silvered in the moonlight. A lone figure passed by, moving swiftly and silently, cloak trailing. The tall shape, the hurried stride, it was unmistakably Mr. Halcombe. And he was not walking toward the vicarage. He was heading toward the old mill.
"Long disused, where the river cut black and silent through the meadow." Miss Marple watched until he vanished into the dark.
Then she returned to her chair, picked up her knitting, and began to unpick 3 careful rows, her mind unravelling and reweaving far faster than her hands. Chapter 7. The shadows at the mill the following evening. The mist rose early from the river, wrapping the lower meadow in a soft grey hush. The old watermill stood at the edge of that mist like a brooding sentinel, its wheel long since still, its windows blank as blind eyes. Children dared each other to run past it on autumn nights, and most ran shrieking. But tonight there were no children, no laughter, only the slow drip of water from the mossed eaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Miss Marple, small and pale against the darkness, paused on the lane above, adjusting the shawl about her shoulders. She had taken the long way round so as not to be seen leaving her cottage. An elderly lady going out alone after dusk could stir gossip, and she had no wish to become part of the village's ever-churning tales. She carried no lantern. She preferred to let her eyes adjust, as she had once told young Inspector Cray. "You see more when you are not trying to be seen yourself." A rustle reached her from the lower path. She froze, then edged closer, her sensible shoes making almost no sound on the damp grass. There he was again, Mr. Halcombe, the curate. He slipped through the gap in the mill's sagging door, as though accustomed to its creak. He held something in his hand, a parcel wrapped in oilcloth no larger than a book, and his head turned this way and that like a hare before a hawk. Miss Marple waited until the door shut behind him. Then she moved closer, crouching slightly behind the cover of a hawthorn bush.
A faint light glimmered through a crack in the boards.
She strained to catch sounds, the muted scrape of wood, a low mutter. And then another voice, not Halcombe's, a woman's voice, low, taut, unmistakable.
"Can't keep it here forever," the voice was saying. "It's dangerous." "Where else?" Halcombe hissed back.
"No one comes here. No one dare come here." Miss Marple's brows knitted. The woman's voice, she knew it. Yes, Mrs. Whitcomb, the vicarage housekeeper. There was a long silence inside, broken only by the plop of water dripping from the mill wheel. Then Halcombe again, almost pleading, "If anyone finds it, if they even suspect, we're finished. You understand that, don't you? Finished." "Then you should have thought of that before," Mrs. Whitcomb said flatly. "Before the picnic, before the vicar found out." Miss Marple felt a tiny chill feather down her spine. "The vicar found out? About what, precisely?" A sharp sound followed, like a box being shoved across stone. The light dimmed. Then the door creaked again, and the two figures slipped out. Halcombe first, Mrs. Whitcomb close behind, her shawl pulled tightly over her head. They didn't speak. They didn't even look at one another. They walked quickly in opposite directions, swallowed almost at once by the fog. When they were gone, Miss Marple waited a long moment, listening to the night settle back into itself. Then, quite calmly, she rose and made her way down the slope to the mill door. It hung slightly open. Inside, the air smelled of mould and river damp. She paused just beyond the threshold, letting the pale moonlight fall across the floor. And there it was, a small dark smear on the stone. Fresh. She bent closer, not mud, not ink, blood. Her gaze swept the shadowed room. And there, just behind the old millstone, something caught the moonlight, a thread of bright scarlet wool. Scarlet. Miss Marple straightened slowly, her face unreadable. She reached into her reticule and drew out a little notebook, writing down 3 simple words. Blood. Scarlet wool. Then she tucked it away, closed the mill door with careful quiet, and walked home as though she had merely been out admiring the moon. Chapter 8. A Tangle of Threads. The following morning broke pale and watery, with thin sunlight struggling through a gauze of lingering mist. The village seemed to exhale as if relieved to see daylight at all. Yet beneath its fresh-washed calm, the tension had deepened. Doors that once stood open now remained firmly latched. Conversations stopped abruptly when certain footsteps passed by. Miss Marple sat at her breakfast table, a modest setting of boiled egg, buttered toast, and the Times. Her knitting bag lay at her feet, though her hands were quite still. She was thinking, neatly, quietly, with the tidy precision she might apply to darning a sock, scarlet wool. She had seen it last night at the mill, caught on the splinter of a beam beside the bloodstain. And scarlet was not a common colour here in Willowbrook, where the women preferred soft heathers, navy serges, and cream cardigans.
Only one person, in fact, came to mind, Miss Lydia Crane,
the vicar's niece. Lydia had worn a brilliant scarlet jumper to the vicar's picnic, the same jumper that had caused old Mrs. Godfrey to remark, loudly, that it was more suited to the Riviera than a church gathering. Lydia had only laughed, tossing her dark hair, and gone off to help arrange the raffle table beside Mr. Pendleton. Mr. Pendleton, who by that evening lay dead. Miss Marple took her umbrella and walked the short distance to the vicarage, where the gardens smelled of wet roses and earth. Mrs. Whitcomb was on her knees among the borders, weeding with fierce concentration. She glanced up, her face set. "Good morning," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "A fine day for the roses," Mrs. Whitcomb sniffed. "Roses don't care for the weather. They care for pruning." She stood, brushing soil from her gloves. "The vicar's not at home." "Oh, I had hoped to see young Miss Lydia, actually," Miss Marple said mildly. Mrs. Whitcomb's lips tightened. "She's gone into Marleycombe with Mr. Halcombe. Errands." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "The curate is very attentive to the young lady, I see." "She's the vicar's niece," Mrs. Whitcombe said sharply. "It's only proper." Then after a pause, "She's a good girl." "Not what people say." Miss Marple's blue eyes lingered on her.
"And what do people say?"
Mrs. Whitcombe gave no reply. She picked up her basket and strode inside without another word, the door shutting with a final click. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Godfrey, who was delighted to have an excuse to hold court. "Oh,
"Lydia Crane," she said, settling herself among her chintz cushions.
a very pretty girl if one likes that dark, dramatic sort of beauty.
Always flitting about, always laughing."
Too much laughing, if you ask me. They say she's set her cap at poor Mr. Halcombe, and he, of course, hasn't the sense God gave a rabbit. Is that so?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "Oh, indeed."
"And there's more."
"You didn't hear this from me, of course, but Lydia was seen with Mr. Pendleton the day before the picnic, walking down by the river."
"Holding his arm, imagine?"
"He was twice her age if he was a day. Not that he'd have minded. Pendleton always had an eye for a pretty girl. But he'd been in some financial muddle, I believe."
"Insurance or inheritance or something."
"It's all terribly hush-hush." Miss Marple sipped her tea quietly. That evening, as twilight deepened, she sat in her parlour and opened her knitting bag. From its depths she withdrew a small scrap of yarn, found earlier that afternoon at the village green, a single scarlet thread caught on the handle of Pendleton's old walking stick, which had been placed on display outside the police station for some unexplained reason. She laid it next to the thread she had found at the mill. The match was perfect. She did not smile, but her needles clicked with brisk satisfaction as she began a new row. People often underestimated how revealing clothing could be, particularly when chosen carelessly in bright colours. Bright things left traces, and those who believed themselves clever often forgot how very small those traces could be. In Miss Marple's experience,
murderers nearly always forgot that. Chapter 9. A Web of Motives. The sun returned to Willowbrook the next day, sharp and golden,
casting long shadows from the gables and chimneys as if to remind the village how very thin the border between light and dark could be. From her parlour window, Miss Marple watched the postman trudge up the lane, whistling off-key. Children hurried to the schoolhouse with satchels bouncing. Yet there was something oddly brittle about the brightness, like gilt on cracked china. Miss Marple folded away her knitting. She had been thinking all night, and her mind now held a quiet certainty. Mr. Pendleton's death had very little to do with tempers or accidents. It had to do with secrets and the desperate, clumsy things people did to keep them, and if there were secrets, Lydia Crane was at the heart of them. Miss Marple chose to begin her inquiries at the Marleycombe branch of Lloyd & Whitby, solicitors. She had once helped young Mr. Whitby locate his great-aunt's missing pearls behind the hat-stand, and he had never quite recovered from the embarrassment. He greeted her now with a flush and a stammer. "My dear Miss Marple, what an unexpected pleasure. Do sit down. May I offer you tea?"
"Thank you, but I shan't keep you long," Miss Marple said, settling her gloves neatly in her lap.
"I am curious, you see, about the late Mr. Pendleton's affairs, strictly out of concern for dear Reverend Crane, who has seemed quite
burdened of late." Mr. Whitby hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Well,
there's nothing formally public yet, but Pendleton's estate was in dreadful disorder. He mortgaged his house twice over, and his investments, rather foolish ventures in motor-car parts of all things, had collapsed. In fact, he took out a life insurance policy only a fortnight before he died. Substantial, too. £20,000. "Goodness," said Miss Marple softly. "And who was the beneficiary, may one ask?" Mr. Whitby coloured. "Miss Lydia Crane. Quite astonishing, really. No one knows why." Miss Marple thanked him and walked the slow road back to Willowbrook. £20,000. a fortune by village standards. Enough to make a young woman very independent indeed. As she reached the lane by the churchyard, she caught sight of Mr. Halcombe speaking earnestly with Lydia near the lych gate. They were too far off for words to carry, but their posture spoke volumes. Lydia's arms crossed, head turned away, Halcombe leaning close, voice urgent. Then Lydia spun on her heel and walked swiftly off toward the vicarage, her red jumper bright as a flame against the grey stones. Halcombe remained, slumping onto the gate-post, staring after her with an expression of mingled despair and longing. Miss Marple, unnoticed, observed him for a long moment. Young men were often very bad at hiding things. That afternoon, she called on Inspector Cray at the police station, a spare, sandy-haired man with a nervous moustache who had learned long ago to treat Miss Marple's opinions with grave seriousness. "I suppose you've heard," he said, shuffling papers. "We're still holding that gardener fellow. Tom Bligh. Everyone's quite convinced he quarrelled with Pendleton over wages." Said Miss Marple, gently. "And do you believe it yourself, Inspector?" Cray sighed. "Between you and me, no. But appearances, Miss Marple, appearances." The man had mud on his boots and a bad temper. "It's enough for half the village." "And yet," Miss Marple said, "Mr. Pendleton had recently taken out a very large life insurance policy in favour of Miss Lydia Crane. Did you know that?" The inspector's head shot up. "Crane? Good Lord. No, I didn't." "I rather thought not," said Miss Marple, mildly. That evening, word trickled through the village like a thin thread of smoke. Lydia Crane was planning to leave Willowbrook. A small travelling case had been seen on her bed, and Mrs. Whitcomb had ordered the boy from the grocer's to bring extra twine for parcels. Miss Marple sat in her parlour, watching the golden lamplight flicker on her polished teacup. The threads were tightening.
Lydia had motive, money.
Halcombe had motive, love, or fear, or both, and the two of them together had crept to the abandoned mill to hide something they dared not bring home, something connected to blood. Miss Marple reached for her little notebook and wrote a single, new line beneath her careful jottings. Perhaps not murder for gain alone, but murder to conceal a scandal. Her expression did not change, but her mind, quiet and sharp as a needle, had begun to weave the final shape of the web. If you like, I can continue with Chapter 10, The Second Death, where a shocking new incident shakes the village and forces the real killer's hand. Shall I write Chapter 10 next? Chapter 10. The Second Death. A storm came in the night, wild and sudden, lashing the village with rain that clawed at the shutters and howled down the chimneys like a lost soul. By morning it had passed, leaving Willowbrook washed clean and eerily still, as though the world had been emptied out and set to rights again. But it had not been set to rights. The calm was broken at 8:30 by the vicarage bell. Clanging madly, Mrs. Porter, who lived opposite, flung open her window and saw Lydia Crane standing in the garden, her scarlet jumper darkened to crimson with the wet, her hair loose about her shoulders.
Her face as white as the lily bed behind her. "He's dead,"
Lydia cried.
"He's dead at the mill."
By the time Inspector Cray arrived, half the village had gathered on the lane. Miss Marple came quietly at the rear of the crowd, her shawl pinned firmly, her expression as mild as ever. She followed the path down to the old watermill, where constables already stood with set jaws and folded arms. The scene was grim. Mr. Halcombe lay just inside the doorway on the cold stone, one arm flung wide, his collar torn askew. His eyes stared glassily at the ceiling beams. Nearby, a cracked lantern had rolled into a puddle, the wick blackened and cold. "Gas," muttered Cray. "Faulty lamp. Must have suffocated." But Miss Marple, peering delicately from the threshold, noted two small things at once. The lantern was unlit, and Halcombe's mouth bore a faint bluish tinge that spoke not of gas at all, but of something rather more deliberate. Poison. Lydia stood apart, shivering though the morning was warm. Mrs. Whitcomb hovered near her like a watchful crow. "Tell me what happened," Cray demanded. He, Lydia stammered, then pressed her hands to her face. "He asked me to meet him here. He said we had to talk."
I came and I found him like this. Oh God, Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her sleeve.
"My dear, was Mr. Halcombe troubled?"
Had he spoken of despair? No.
Lydia dropped her hands, her eyes flashing. "He wasn't like that. He was frightened, that's all." "Of what precisely?" Miss Marple asked softly. Lydia opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her gaze darted to Mrs. Whitcomb, whose stony face gave nothing away. By noon, Cray had cleared the crowd and sent the body away under canvas. The constables swept the mill floor, muttering. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, alone. There was a broken tea flask by the wall. She bent down, sniffing. The faint, bitter tang of almonds lingered. Cyanide. Quick, certain, cruel. On the floor, caught in the crack of a stone, lay another tiny thread of scarlet wool. Miss Marple did not touch it. She only looked at it, her eyes gone very calm. That evening, the village trembled like a violin string drawn too tight. Some whispered Halcombe had killed himself from guilt over Pendleton. Others hissed that Lydia had done it to silence him. Still others muttered of secret love triangles and whispered confessions. The only thing anyone agreed upon was that something wicked had rooted itself in Willowbrook's soft soil and was now flowering dread. Miss Marple sat in her parlour as twilight bled into night. She wrote 3 short lines in her little notebook. Halcombe knew the truth. Halcombe planned to speak. Halcombe silenced. She shut the notebook and laid it beside her knitting. The pattern was clear now. 1 murder could be passion or panic. 2 murders meant design. Chapter 11. The final gambit. Tension around the camp had thickened like the fog rolling down from the mountains. For weeks the rebels had whispered of a final strike, a daring move that could either free them from centuries of chains or bury their names forever beneath the ashes of history. Now, as the moon hovered like a watchful eye in the night sky, the plan was set into motion. Ibrahim stood apart from the others, gazing at the distant glow of the enemy's fortress. His once quiet eyes now carried the storm of 1,000 battles. Every scar on his body told a story, and every heartbeat was a countdown. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about rewriting the destiny of their people. "Are you ready?"
asked Malika, stepping beside him.
Her voice carried the edge of steel, but her hand trembled slightly as it brushed her dagger's hilt. She had lost her brother in the first wave, her father in the second. Now she stood poised to risk what little of her heart remained. "I've been ready since the day they burned our village," Ibrahim replied, his voice low. He tightened the strap of his rifle and turned to face the group.
"Tonight we either become legends
or ghosts." The team moved like shadows across the dark hills, their blackened faces blending into the earth. They navigated through thorned underbrush and rocky crevices until the looming fortress rose before them, massive, cold, and crawling with guards. Malika gave the signal. 3 rebels cut the power lines while another jammed the fortress's communications. The rest slipped through the drainage tunnels beneath the outer wall. Ibrahim led the way, water up to his chest, his breath measured and silent. Inside, alarms suddenly shrieked. They had been spotted. "Move!" Ibrahim barked, shoving forward. Bullets ricocheted off stone walls as the rebels surged upward through the corridors. The plan was crumbling, but there was no turning back. They reached the control chamber, where the enemy's command council met, and Ibrahim hurled a satchel of
Explosives onto the table. History ends here, he growled. They
dived for cover as the room erupted in fire and thunder. The shockwave shattered windows across the fortress, and flames licked the night sky. As they fled through the chaos, Malika stumbled, clutching her side where shrapnel had torn through her. Ibrahim caught her arm and dragged her onward, his muscles burning. They burst out onto the cliffside, just as enemy reinforcements closed in behind them. Ibrahim fired his last round into a fuel tank at the base of the fortress. The explosion was so massive it lit the entire valley like daylight. Stone walls collapsed.
towers crumbled.
And for the first time in decades, the enemy stronghold was nothing but ruins. The rebels disappeared into the forest's black embrace as the fortress sank behind them in smoke and screams. By sunrise, news had spread across the land. The Empire's fortress had fallen. And in that single moment, hope, long buried under fear, rose like a roaring fire in the hearts of the oppressed. Ibrahim stood on a distant ridge, watching the smoke curl toward the heavens. Malika, pale but alive, leaned on his shoulder. "This is just the beginning," she whispered. "Yes," Ibrahim said quietly, eyes fixed on the rising sun. "Now we build a nation." Chapter 12. The Rebirth. The ruins still smoked days after the fortress had fallen. Charred stones lay scattered like the bones of a giant, and the air was thick with the smell of fire and freedom. For the first time in living memory, no enemy banners waved over the hills. The empire had been broken, its heart ripped out in one night of courage and chaos. But victory brought its own burden. The rebels, once bound by the single purpose of destruction, now faced a new and uncertain task: creation. Ibrahim stood atop the blackened walls of what had been the fortress's outer gate. Below him, hundreds of villagers, farmers, traders, blacksmiths, and former prisoners had gathered. Their faces were hollow with hunger, yet shining with something new: possibility. He raised his voice over the restless murmur of the crowd. "We have no king," he declared. "No masters, no chains. This land belongs to its people now. But freedom is only the beginning. If we do not build something stronger than fear, the old tyrants or new ones will return." A silence followed. Then Malika stepped forward, her arms still bandaged from the shrapnel wound. "Then let us build together," she said. "A council chosen by all. Not by blood, not by wealth, not by fear, but by trust." The crowd erupted with shouts of agreement. For the first time, people who had never raised their voices in public were now speaking of rights, of laws, of schools and wells and markets. The ruins became their meeting ground, their first assembly hall. Within days, Ibrahim and Malika oversaw the formation of the People's Council, a group of 12 elected voices from every corner of their land: shepherds from the hills, fisherfolk from the rivers, healers from the villages, and even one former soldier who had defected during the uprising. They began laying stones where the fortress had fallen, not for a new palace, but for a hall of the people, where no throne would stand, only a round table where every voice was equal. Still, peace was fragile. Small war bands of surviving enemy soldiers prowled the outer valleys, looting what they could. Food was scarce, and sickness spread quickly among the camps. Late one night, as the council slept in their makeshift tents, Ibrahim stood by the river, staring at his reflection. His body bore the scars of war, and his soul carried heavier wounds still. Could a man forged in battle become a builder of peace? Malika joined him silently, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "You doubt yourself," she said softly. "I know how to fight," Ibrahim replied. "But this
This is something else." She touched his hand.
then learn The people will follow you not because you are perfect, but because you are willing to change. Dawn broke over the valley, golden and warm, and for the first time in years, Ibrahim felt the weight on his chest lift just slightly. The sun caught the shattered stones, making them gleam like jewels.
As if even the earth itself was eager to begin again. And so the rebuilding began, not with the clash of swords,
but with the ringing of hammers and the laughter of children running through the dust. The age of rebellion had ended. The age of rebirth had begun. Chapter 13. Shadows.
of the old world, though the people of
Rose Hill, as the villagers had begun calling their reborn home, worked from dawn to dusk, rebuilding their shattered lives. The world beyond their valleys was far from still. Empires do not die quietly, and the one they had toppled had roots like iron buried deep in distant cities and old loyalties. Far across the mountains, in a forgotten fortress of black stone and bitter wind, 3 figures met in secret. The torches on the walls flickered as if they feared to reveal the faces of those who conspired there. The first was Lord Vicar, once a general of the Empire, now a fugitive with a scar running from his brow to his jaw. The second, Lady Serene, had once ruled the imperial treasury and now controlled what was left of its gold. The third, a hooded man known only as the Raven, spoke little but carried news from the shadows. "They think it's over," Vicar growled, slamming his fist onto the table. "They think a handful of peasants with stolen swords have ended centuries of dominion. Fools!" Serene's voice was cold as ice. "It is not their swords that concern me. It is their hope."
Hope spreads faster than fire, and if it reaches the other provinces...
She trailed off, her jeweled fingers tightening around her goblet. The Raven finally spoke, his voice as soft as falling ash. "The people believe this Ibrahim is their savior. He has turned rebels into builders.
That is dangerous.
If he builds something lasting, the old order can never return." "Then he must not build it," Vicar said. "We strike at him, not with armies, not yet. We cut away the roots before the tree grows strong." Serene leaned forward. "Sabotage, division, turn his own people against him. If they begin to doubt, they will tear themselves apart without our lifting a blade." The Raven nodded. "I have agents already among them."
Merchants, travellers, even one of the new councillors.
They whisper doubts, spread rumours. A spark, carefully placed, can burn down a house faster than any siege. And so the conspiracy was born, a plan not of open war, but of silent rot. Back in Rose Hill, the whispers had already begun one evening. As the People's Council gathered in the half-built hall, a heated argument flared between 2 councillors, old Fenric, a stubborn farmer, and Lena, the young blacksmith's daughter. They say Malika keeps the grain stores locked for her own village. Fenric barked, slamming his fist on the table. "That's a lie," Lena shot back. "I've seen her distributing food myself. You're listening to merchants who want to hoard it for profit." "Then why are their wagons always full while our children starve?" Ibrahim watched the quarrel silently, troubled. Over the past week, small incidents had multiplied. Tools gone missing, livestock poisoned, shipments of stone delayed by accidents on the roads. Every misfortune carried a shadow of suspicion, and every shadow seemed to point at someone new. Malika confronted him after the meeting, her brow furrowed.
"Someone is sowing discord, Ibrahim."
"We must find out who," he nodded grimly.
"Hope can be built."
"But fear is faster, and I fear fear has already entered our gates." That night, as he walked alone through the silent village streets, Ibrahim saw a small mark scratched into the wooden door of a warehouse, a raven, carved crudely. Its wings spread wide, a chill ran through him. The old world was not dead, it was waiting, and it was watching. Chapter 14. The poisoned roots rain lashed against the half-built rooftops of Rose Hill as if the heavens themselves sought to wash away the fragile dream taking shape there. The village, which only weeks ago had been alive with laughter and purpose, now hummed with tension so taut it seemed ready to snap. Ibrahim felt it with every step he took through the muddy lanes. Conversation stopped as he passed. People turned away quickly, pretending to be busy. He had once been the hero who led them to freedom. Now he saw doubt in their eyes, as though they wondered if they had merely exchanged one master for another. That morning, disaster struck. The grain stores, the precious supply they had guarded like gold, had been found ruined. The sacks were torn open, soaked in oil and fouled with rat poison. By the time anyone discovered it, the damage was complete. A month's food was lost. The council gathered in a storm of fury and fear inside the unfinished hall of the people. Rain dripped through the open rafters, pattering onto the wooden table as accusations flew. "This is Malika's doing," snapped Fenric, his voice hoarse with rage.
"She alone had the keys to the stores." "That is a lie,"
Malika shot back, standing so quickly her chair toppled over. "I locked them as I always do."
"Ask the guards." "The guards?"
Lena barked.
"Half of them are from your village. Perhaps they are in on it too." "Enough," Ibrahim said sharply, his voice cutting through the din.
Silence fell, but it was a brittle silence full of unspoken hatred. "This was not the work of any one of you," he continued slowly. "It was sabotage. Someone wishes us to tear each other apart," Fenric sneered.
"Convenient, isn't it?"
"Blame invisible enemies rather than admit our own council has traitors." Ibrahim's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. He could feel the invisible threads pulling. Someone, somewhere, was tugging them skillfully, turning his hard-won unity into distrust. That night, he walked the ruined storehouses alone. The rain had stopped, leaving the air sharp and cold. He crouched beside one of the torn sacks, running his fingers over the gash. It was clean, deliberate, not the work of rats or accidents. Then he saw it again, etched faintly into the inside of the door, almost hidden by shadow.
A raven, the same mark he had seen nights ago. His blood ran cold. The next day brought worse news.
The road from the outer farms had collapsed in a sudden landslide, cutting off their supply of fresh vegetables and meat. A messenger arrived, gasping, with mud caked on his boots, swearing the road had been deliberately weakened with picks during the night. Whispers grew.
"Louder. Perhaps Ibrahim himself has grown tired of feeding us,"
someone muttered near the well. "Perhaps Malika means to starve us and seize power," another replied. "Perhaps the council will start executing thieves next, just like the old empire did." Fear, once only a shadow, was now everywhere. That evening, Malika came to Ibrahim's tent. Her face was pale with exhaustion, her eyes dark from sleeplessness. "They will destroy themselves," she whispered. "Whoever our enemy is, they know exactly where to strike. Not our walls, not our weapons, our trust." Ibrahim nodded slowly. "And we must fight as they do, quietly, patiently," she frowned. "What are you planning?" "A trap," he said. "But for that, we must let them believe they are winning." The next morning, he called a gathering in the village square. Rain clouds still loomed, but people came, drawn by curiosity, suspicion, or perhaps desperation. Ibrahim stood before them, cloak whipping in the wind.
"I will not hide the truth," he said.
"We are under attack not by armies, but by whispers. By poison in our grain, by hands in the dark. There are traitors among us." A shudder passed through the crowd. "And so," he continued, "I will step down from the council for 7 days. During that time you will govern yourselves. If I am the tyrant they claim I am, you will be free without me. If not, perhaps you will see who truly benefits from our division." Gasps rippled. Fenric looked smug. Malika looked stricken. But Ibrahim only watched their faces, calm and cold inside. He was not stepping aside from weakness. He was baiting the trap. He knew that the enemy, thinking the leader gone and the village leaderless, would move boldly now. And when they did, he would be waiting. Chapter 15. The Raven's Snare. The air in Rosehill grew strange without Ibrahim at the helm, thin and restless, like the silence before a storm. Though he still walked the village streets quietly at dawn and dusk, he no longer spoke in meetings or signed decrees. To most, it seemed as though he had truly stepped down. But unseen, he watched everything. Malika was the only one who knew his plan. Together they had arranged for a handful of loyal friends, hunters, night watchmen, and 2 old spies from the rebellion to move through the shadows, unseen by the council or the villagers. Ibrahim had told them only this: say nothing,
Touch nothing.
but watch everything. He suspected the enemy was close now, believing victory near. He needed them to reveal themselves, not as whispers, but in the act. The cracks widened quickly. With Ibrahim silent, the council fell into chaos. Fenric tried to take charge, demanding the power to distribute what little food remained. Lena opposed him fiercely, accusing him of hoarding grain for his own fields. 3 other councillors quit outright, declaring that the dream of a people's hall had been a fantasy from the start. Rumours multiplied like flies. The blacksmith's forge burned down in the night. A poisoned well killed 2 goats and sickened a child. An anonymous letter appeared on the council's table. The lion has left his den. Take the throne while you can. One moonless night, Malika slipped into Ibrahim's tent. It's working, she whispered. They believe you've abandoned them.
They're desperate.
If the enemy means to strike, it will be now. Ibrahim's eyes, shadowed by the lamplight, did not move from the map on his table. They will strike at the heart, he murmured. The grain is gone, the forges are burned. What remains that could still unite them? The hall, Malika breathed. If they destroy it before it's complete, hope dies with it. Exactly, he pointed to the map, a sketch of the hall's layout, with small marks in charcoal. Hidden watchposts.
Signal lines.
Escape tunnels from the old fortress buried beneath. I built the foundations myself, he said quietly. I left something inside the stones, a way to know who walks there in the dark. 3 nights later, the enemy came. The wind was sharp and dry, carrying the scent of ash from the old hills. A group of 6 figures in dark cloaks crept across the village square, their boots soundless on the stones. They moved like men who had done this before, swift, silent, certain. Inside the hall, they planted oil-soaked cloth among the timbers. One of them, a tall man with a scar slashing across his cheek, gave clipped orders. Quickly. The dawn guard changes at first bell. By the time they know, the place will be cinders. They did not know the stones beneath their feet were listening. Ibrahim crouched in the darkness of the old escape tunnel beneath the hall, fingers pressed to the cold rock. A tiny thread of silver wire ran from the foundation stones to his hand. He felt the faintest tremor through it. Footsteps above, he gave a short nod. The trap sprang. Hidden panels crashed down across the exits, sealing the saboteurs inside. From the shadows outside, Malika and the watchers surged forward, cutting off their retreat. One of the dark-cloaked figures tried to draw a blade, but found Ibrahim already standing before him. You've brought the raven's shadow into my house, Ibrahim said softly. But you forgot. Ravens flee the fire when it rises beneath them. He hurled the oil lamp he carried into the center of the hall, not onto the wood, but into a ring of sand he had prepared earlier. The sudden bloom of light blinded the attackers for an instant. It was enough. The fight was swift, brutal, and silent. When it was done, 5 lay bound on the floor. The 6th, the scarred man, spat blood and laughter at Ibrahim's feet. You think this ends it? He rasped. We are only the first wave. The raven watches.
He waits? Then let him wait, Ibrahim replied coldly.
We will be ready. By dawn, the villagers awoke to find the would-be arsonists imprisoned in the old watchtower, guarded by the same people who once stood as rebels. The hall stood untouched, its half-built timbers glowing gold in the early light. The council gathered, ashamed and awed. Fenric could not meet Ibrahim's gaze.
You planned this?
Lena asked at last, her voice trembling. Yes, Ibrahim said simply, because our enemy never stopped planning either. For the first time in days, the village exhaled. The poison had not been purged entirely, but its roots had been exposed, and somewhere far away in that fortress of black stone, the raven received the news from his spies and smiled thinly. The lion has teeth, he murmured. Good. A wounded lion is far more dangerous than a dead one. Chapter 16. The Raven's Return. A mist clung to the fields as autumn settled over Rose Hill. The mornings were quieter now, the clang of hammers replaced by the rasp of saws as the hall's frame rose sturdier than ever. To the villagers, it seemed the storm had passed. The saboteurs were locked away, the council was slowly mending its rifts, and Ibrahim had resumed his place among them, calmer and graver than before. But Ibrahim knew peace could be the sharpest illusion. He felt it in the air like the faint smell of iron before rain. The raven had lost his first game, but men like that did not vanish. They shifted shape, they waited. And so Ibrahim watched the roads. One cold morning, a traveller arrived. He came on foot, wrapped in a weathered brown cloak, a lute slung across his back. He called himself Corvin, a wandering bard, and his eyes were the colour of smoke, soft, unreadable. He spoke gently, sang beautifully, and within hours had half the village lingering near the square to hear his ballads of distant seas and lost loves. Even Malika smiled faintly as she passed him. But Ibrahim watched with narrowed eyes. Corvin never asked for coin, only for stories. He moved easily between friend groups, slipping into private corners, listening more than speaking. And there was something about the way he walked, as if he always knew exactly where everyone else's shadow fell. That evening, Ibrahim summoned Malika to the old fortress wall, where they had once stood after victory. That man, he said, watching the village lights below, his name is no accident. Corvus means raven. You think it's him? She whispered. I think the raven would not send others to do what he considers art. He will come himself and not with swords. With words, Malika frowned.
How do we fight words? By giving him none of ours, Ibrahim replied.
Let him believe he moves unseen. A hunter who knows he is watched becomes clumsy. Days passed. Corvin drifted through Rose Hill like a pleasant breeze, and slowly small things began to change. Carpenter quietly complained that Ibrahim had too much power again. Brewer grumbled that the council met in secret. 2 of the captured saboteurs escaped one night, though no one could explain how the tower locks
had been opened without breaking. Then Lena,
the young councillor, began spending her evenings with Corvin by the well. She laughed at his stories, and sometimes her laughter carried the faint edge of bitterness when she spoke of the council's failures. Malika caught sight of it and brought word to Ibrahim. He only nodded grimly. It has begun, he said. He will break our unity by breaking our faith in each other. If Lena turns, the others will follow. She is their spark. That night, Ibrahim went alone to the tower, where the 4 remaining saboteurs were held. He stood outside their cells, silent, while they glared at him with hatred. Then he said quietly, "You had help. Someone unlocked your comrade's chains. None spoke. I will find who, Ibrahim said softly, and when I do, you will wish the empire had finished you. He left them trembling in the cold. Meanwhile, the raven, Corvin, sat alone by the dying fire outside his rented hut, strumming a single low note again and again. His hood was pushed back now, and the moonlight caught the faint scar along his jaw. A shadow approached. "Lena, you were right," she murmured. "He speaks of freedom but keeps all power for himself. He will never give it up." The raven smiled, a slow, thin smile. "Then help me take it," he whispered. "Not for me, for the people." Lena hesitated, and then nodded. And so, with one quiet word, the raven's snare tightened again. Far above, on the fortress wall, Ibrahim watched the two figures below. His cloak rippled in the night wind, and his eyes were cold as stone. The game had changed. The enemy was no longer outside the gates. He was inside the heart. Chapter 17. A knife in the circle. The first frost of the season crept over Rosehill like a veil of glass. In the mornings the grass crackled underfoot, and breath rose in white plumes from the mouths of workers hauling timber to the hall. Yet beneath the crisp air and cheerful industry, unease curled like smoke. Something had shifted in the council. Ibrahim sensed it in the way they sat now, slightly apart from one another, avoiding one another's eyes. Once their arguments had been loud but earnest, each voice passionate for the village's future. Now their words were measured, guarded, as if every syllable might later be used against them. And at the edge of the square, always, sat Corvin the bard, strumming softly, never looking at them yet, somehow always listening. The breaking point came 3 nights later. The council gathered by lamplight inside the unfinished hall, the walls casting long, restless shadows around them. The topic was food distribution, what remained of their harvest after the grain poisoning. Malika proposed rationing for the winter months. Lena stood to oppose her. Her tone was sharp, unrecognizably bitter. "Rationing will only make the people fear again," Lena said. "We fought to be free, not to be ordered like cattle." "This is not tyranny," Malika replied coolly.
It is survival. And who decides what survival means? You, Ibrahim? Always the same voices.
Lena's voice cracked like glass. "We speak of a council, but we still kneel to one man," murmurs rippled around the table. Fenric nodded grimly, eyes glinting. Ibrahim sat very still. "You think I cling to power," he said quietly.
You think I will not step aside when the time comes?
"Do you believe that?" "Yes," Lena said, clear, defiant. The silence that followed was colder than the frost outside. Later that night, as the others drifted away, Ibrahim lingered in the hall's shadows. Malika joined him, her face taut with worry. "She's changed," she whispered. "She was our brightest hope. Now she repeats his words like scripture." "Yes," Ibrahim murmured, "because they are his words." He told her then what he had suspected, that Corvin was the raven in disguise, that Lena was now his unwitting pawn, and that their unity would crumble from within unless he stopped it, swiftly, but without blood. "Why not expose him?" Malika demanded.
Tell them what you know.
"Because truth shouted is just another sound," Ibrahim said. "But truth shown becomes unbreakable." He turned, cloak swirling behind him. "We will not accuse. We will let him think he has won, and then we will open the floor beneath him." The next day, Corvin made his move. With calculated ease, he rose during the morning gathering in the square.
Lute in hand, I have heard your tales, he said gently.
His voice carrying through the crowd, of courage, of sacrifice. But courage has grown weary, has it not?
You built this dream together.
yet one man still claims it as his. He sang then, a haunting melody, words sliding like silver. The lion roars, but the flock goes hungry, the lion guards, yet the sheep fear still. Better the flock, without the lion's shadow, than the lion who never leaves the hill. It was beautiful.
And deadly. By evening, whispers surged through the village like a fever.
A petition appeared overnight, signed by 24 names, demanding Ibrahim step down permanently and let Lena lead until new elections could be held. Malika brought it to him.
Her hands trembling. They mean to remove you, she whispered. I know, Ibrahim said softly.
He laid the petition on the table as though it were a playing card. And they will succeed. For a day, she stared at him. You're going to let them? He looked out the tent flap at the glow of fires across the village, at the people laughing nervously as Corvin played by the well. Sometimes, he said, a snare must close around your own foot to catch the hunter who follows it. And so the council met again at dusk. Before the whole village, Ibrahim rose from his seat and unpinned the badge from his cloak. I will honor the will of the people, he said, his voice clear and steady. I stepped down.
Lena will serve as chair of the council. Gasps swept the hall.
Corvin smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly. Lena lifted her chin, trying to look brave, though her hands trembled. And just like that, the trap was set. Ibrahim walked calmly from the hall, the door closing behind him, the cold night swallowing his silhouette. The lion had left the circle, or so they thought. Chapter 18. The quiet reckoning that eased our autumn sunlight slanted across the green as though nothing had ever happened in Willowbrook. Children raced their hoops along the path, and Mrs. Potter's roses leaned heavily over her white garden fence, nodding in the breeze. The village was quietly returning to its rhythms, but beneath the surface something had shifted. The shadow of murder lingered, faint as the scent of smoke after a fire. Miss Marple, seated by the vicarage drawing-room window, watched the world with her calm, thoughtful eyes. She had accepted Reverend Clement's invitation for tea, though he had been flustered to find her already arranging the sugar bowl so it faced precisely east. It seems so strange, he murmured, pouring her cup with an unsteady hand. To think that Mr. Blackwell, our Mr. Blackwell, could do such a thing.
I keep wondering if I might have noticed.
If I had been more observant, most people, Miss Marple said gently, prefer to look away from unpleasant truths. It is rather a human habit. But when one has spent as much time as I have among village gossip, one learns that human nature does not change, even when people wear very respectable hats. The vicar managed a faint smile. I keep thinking of Mrs. Blackwell, he went on quietly.
She'll be quite ruined by this.
Not only socially, but spiritually, I dare say. I tried to speak with her after the arrest, but she simply closed the door. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. It will be dreadfully hard for her. Yet perhaps she will rebuild. She is stronger than she seems, I think, and she will be spared the worst kind of pity if people learn to speak of it as an unfortunate madness rather than sheer wickedness. That is usually how such things are made tolerable in villages. A silence fell between them, companionable but touched by sorrow. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked home along the lane. The leaves were beginning to turn bronze at the edges, and the hedgerows were studded with blackberries. Passing the old post office, she saw Mrs. Winthrop leaning out to shake her doormat. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," Mrs. Winthrop called with rather forced cheer. "A fine day at last, thank goodness." "Indeed, very fine," Miss Marple replied. There was a moment's awkward pause, an invisible current between them. Everyone in Willowbrook seemed to share it now, that subtle hesitation, as though wondering what Miss Marple knew and what she might say. She gave Mrs. Winthrop a small, warm smile and moved on. At the edge of the green, she encountered Inspector Graves dismounting from his bicycle. He removed his hat politely. "Miss Marple," he said with a rueful nod, "I must admit you were right all along.
I didn't want to see it, but, well,
You have an eye for what's under the carpet." "Only because I've seen so many carpets," she said with a twinkle. He chuckled softly, though there was tiredness in it. "I imagine this will be the quietest place in England again soon." Miss Marple gave a small shrug. "Until something else stirs the dust. Life is rather like that." He looked at her for a moment, perhaps trying to understand how this frail, neat woman could so unerringly find her way through darkness. Then he tipped his hat again and rode away. That evening, back in her own sitting room, Miss Marple set her knitting aside and gazed into the fire. The house was silent, except for the ticking of the clock. She thought of the picnic, the laughter and bunting fluttering in the breeze, and then the sudden, terrible stillness when the truth had come to light. She thought of the way people's faces changed when they learned what they were capable of. It had not pleased her to be right. It never did. But the truth, however unpleasant, was a necessary thing. It cleared the air like a storm breaking on a sultry day, and perhaps, in the quiet that followed, the village could knit itself whole again. With a sigh, she picked up her needles once more. There would be another garden fete next spring. There always was, and Miss Marple, with her small, sharp eyes and her gentle patience, would be there, watching, listening, ready. Epilogue. The turning of the seasons, winter came gently to Willowbrook, as though mindful not to disturb the fragile peace that had returned. Frost traced lacework on cottage windows, and smoke curled steadily from the chimneys. By December, the scandal of the vicar's picnic had softened into something half-remembered, spoken of only in lowered voices and with a certain embarrassed haste, as though the village itself wished to blush and move on. Mrs. Blackwell had gone to stay with a distant cousin in Devon. Some whispered she would never return. Others said she might, in time, under a different name. Her cottage stood shuttered and silent, its once precise garden growing quietly wild. The vicar had resumed his sermons with renewed fervour, more gentle than before, somehow, and Mrs. Clements bustled about the parish with her usual fierce cheer. Mrs. Winthrop reopened her millinery stall, though she now watched her customers with a hint of wary reserve, as if she feared she might overlook something dreadful again. Inspector Graves visited the village, but rarely now. When he did, he tipped his hat to Miss Marple with a look of faint respect, though he never quite managed to meet her eyes for long. Miss Marple herself remained much as she had always been. She trimmed her roses, wrote careful Christmas cards in her small upright script, and took tea with the vicarage once a week. She never mentioned the murder unless asked, and even then, only with the faint air of someone speaking of a long-past thunderstorm. Yet when she walked through the village, the children still ran to open gates for her, and the shopkeepers stood a little straighter. They all understood, though few could have put it into words, that their quiet safety rested in part upon the watchfulness of a frail old lady who seemed to see everything, and to judge nothing too quickly. On the first day of spring, Miss Marple sat at her garden table, knitting as the snowdrops bowed their delicate heads along the path. The air smelled of damp earth and something hopeful. A letter lay beside her teacup from her niece in London, full of theatre news and busy, glittering lives. Miss Marple smiled faintly as she folded it. For all the darkness she had glimpsed, she still preferred her little village, the quiet lanes, the gossiping hedgerows, the polite facades under which all the passions of humanity quietly pulsed. Because, after all, people were very much the same everywhere, and where there were people, there would always be secrets. Miss Marple sipped her tea and went on knitting. Postscript. A whisper on the wind. The spring fete was set for the second Saturday in May. Bunting fluttered from the lich gate of St. Mary's, and the vicar had been heard promising a record number of victorious sponges. Miss Marple strolled through the lane with her parasol, pausing to admire the first blush of lilacs over Mrs. Winthrop's fence. She had just stopped at the greengrocer's for a half-pound of seed cake when young Tommy Clements came rushing past, his face flushed with excitement. "Miss Marple! Did you hear?" he cried, skidding to a halt before her. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Hear what, dear?" "They say," Tommy whispered, eyes wide, "that the squire's maid has gone missing."
"Vanished last night from Marleycombe Hall, just gone."
"Left her shoes by the back door and everything?" "Indeed," said Miss Marple mildly, though her eyes sharpened a fraction.
"That is very odd." "She was supposed to help with the flower stalls at the fete," Tommy added gravely, as though this were the most tragic part. "Quite," said Miss Marple. Tommy ran off again,
leaving the scent of damp grass and schoolboy energy in his wake. Miss Marple remained very still for a moment, gazing down the lane toward the distant shadow of Marleycombe Hall. The sun shone gently on her white hair. A blackbird sang in the hedge, and Miss Marple, with the faintest sigh of anticipation, turned back toward her cottage to put the kettle on.